The Echo Chamber, brought to you by the Holmes Report and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers. And sponsored by March Communications, connecting innovation and people.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. This is Arun Sudhaman, and we're joined in Hong Kong today by Torod Neptune from Lenovo. He is the Chief Communications Officer. Torod, welcome to the Echo Chamber.
Thanks, it's great to be with you.
You're in Hong Kong all week?
I am, this entire week.
Part of your heavy travel schedule,
yes.
I imagine.
Yes, we do our quarterly earnings announcement from a different market around the world every quarter, and this week is Hong Kong.
Oh, I see. Okay, so real work this
Yes.
week. You've been with Lenovo now for, it's more than a year.
Yes, about 14 months.
Okay, and before that you were at Verizon, correct?
Yes.
For a number of years.
7.5 years, almost 8 years.
Okay, right. So how have you found the last 12 months? It's quite a different company, Lenovo, compared to Verizon.
Very much so. It's fascinating, I think. I mean, obviously, two of the bigger distinctions to your question between Verizon and Lenovo is one, the global nature of Lenovo. Verizon, even though it does have an international piece of business, is largely a domestic company and domestic wireless. Lenovo, in reality, is a truly global company in terms of its workforce, which sits across about 160 countries, and then certainly diverse as it relates to the leadership of the company. So of our CEOs, 11, 12 direct reports, they represent about that number of different markets, nationalities. And so I found one of the more fascinating aspects of the last 14 months has been the challenges as a communicator dealing with a global enterprise and thinking about how you manage a reputation of a global entity across some very, very complex and different markets. And then how you think about, again, some of the traditional things that we battle when we think about building and growing a brand globally, given some of the geopolitical issues that you deal with as a global organization as well, has made it a pretty interesting 14 months. And then I think the second thing, to your point about the key insight or difference from me, has really been the degree of consumer understanding that we've had to really integrate into our craft as it relates to really trying to understand what are the mechanisms to influence the way we're perceived as a global brand, and then how you influence that based on different markets, geographies, cultures that are just unbelievably dynamic from geography to geography, market to market, country to country.
Yeah.
So that's an added challenge on top of all the other things that we as communicators are dealing with.
You mentioned the geopolitical issues, which of course are in the news a lot. There's plenty of coverage in terms of issues between US and China at the moment. Lenovo, technically is a Chinese company. Do you find that's affecting perceptions of Lenovo globally?
Yeah, I think at a macro level, I think one of the things that we obviously spend a lot of time trying to think about, again, in the context of driving our brand and our reputation and managing that in a thoughtful and strategic way is really understanding what I think is at the base of a lot of the geopolitical issues that we see today, not just in the US, but throughout the world. And I think that the battle we fight is this tension that exists today between different being good or bad. And as it relates to countries and perceptions, unfortunately, that in many places, I think we're seeing cultural pressure points around a very nationalistic focus in some places. I think we're seeing communities aligning around people who look like and think like them, and I think a disadvantage is for different perspectives. I think there's a lack of appreciation for the value of that, different cultures, and I think in many ways as a brand, I believe that that's a place where Lenovo has an opportunity to lean in and influence a broader global discussion that rides a bit beyond the day-to-day geopolitical issues that we know very well. and really, I think, maps to the core of who we are, to your point, a company that is global today but has strong Chinese roots. And reality is representative about equally throughout the main geographies around the world. And so one of the fascinating things about Lenovo, in the spirit of being a truly diverse company, is I believe there's some value we bring to this discussion about the benefit of a diverse perspective and a diverse people.
Right.
We were one of the first global companies to combine East and West and meld them into what we believe is one of the most integrated cultures. And I think you see the value of those diverse perspectives in our product and our approach to our brand positioning around different is better, is core to our view that we have created across our people and these disparate countries that we represent, a value add to the consumer marketplace globally that is inherent in being different, culturally, socially, geographically, all those things. And in many ways, that's the voice we are trying to be thoughtful about inserting in this geopolitical discussion that's happening. The value of different, and different being a good thing.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that if that's your sort of one of your most important values, and yet we're in an era now where there is this sort of fear of the other.
Right.
So do you feel that Lenovo, because of that, perhaps has more of a responsibility to try and address that?
Right. I think it's an opportunity for us, because it is the discussion that's happening, and I think the opportunity to pivot that in a very positive way is so core and authentic to who we are. So it's not us deciding that we're going to attach ourselves to a neat marketing campaign that's designed to influence, this political discussion. It is about the truest thing about who we are. And I think we have the obligation, because of the weight and the truth of that reality for us. In many ways, I think about it as we've been given permission and the authority to have a very strong point of view and to leverage the weight of our brand in that discussion. And we're trying to do that in a very thoughtful way as we speak.
It's interesting you mentioned that you feel this is actually something that's authentic to Lenovo. We held a roundtable in New York earlier this year on which you featured, along with a couple of other senior communications heads from Mars, PayPal, if I'm not mistaken. And one of the things you said was too many brands are falling in line without having done the work. And you said this in the context of purpose-driven initiatives that lack authenticities, and that they put the veracity of other initiatives at risk. And you said there are brands that should not pursue a social purpose, even though societal pressure thinks they should. Is that something you're seeing a lot of?
I think so. I think the pressure is more significant and growing every day. Again, given the number of issues that I think we're encountering across the world. And I think the interesting forcing factor in terms of what's happening in the marketplace at large is we all know this unbelievable demand for transparency and authenticity. And in some ways, I think that creates an opportunity for us as brands, or responsibility perhaps is a better word, as we think about these cause initiatives that every brand every day is pushed to have a point of view on, or an opinion, or to make a statement on. I think that demand for transparency and authenticity brings with it the responsibility I believe we need to take as shepherds of a corporate reputation or corporate brand, to bring that thoughtful, disciplined approach to where do we have the credibility of voice, the power of voice, the influence of voice that maps tightly to who we are at our core. Not necessarily who we aspire to be, because again, that I think is a little too disingenuous, but who we are at our core today, that allows us to have an outsized influence on that cause or that issue, and then to focus there. I think it's a huge responsibility that my peers, and certainly that I feel, as we look at the brand that is Lenovo today, to drive that kind of discussion and dialogue. Because I think what we also see is the brands that are successful are focused on a very few things. And they do those very few things very well, and they are focused. It is one voice, and they've aligned their organization internally, and they've aligned their voice externally and internally around those things. And those are the most effective, I'd say, impactful brands, and we certainly aspire to be in that class, as opposed to, again, where I fear there is a rush to engage in the issue of the day or the cause of the day that many of us are still falling prey to.
So another angle to this whole area of diversity concerns the industry that you work in, that I cover. And in particular, I think the agency side, where it seems they have been more challenged in terms of delivering the kind of diversity and inclusion that I think society now expects and demands, perhaps compared to the in-house side.
Yes.
Do you think that's a fair characterization?
I would say that's quite fair.
Okay. Now, you held, of course, an agency review last year, a global public relations agency review. You ended up hiring Zeno in the end. Part of that review, in a move that is becoming increasingly common but is still, I think, quite rare, you included diversity criteria as part of the review. You wanted statistics from the agencies on diversity. You didn't make them public, as far as I'm aware.
Correct.
Why did you do that, first of all, and how useful was it?
Sure. I think in terms of the second question, the why, we did that as a brand. I mean, I've been, I'd say, fairly passionate about the issue for quite a while. I think it's unbelievably critical, both for the long-term health and viability of our function, and secondarily for the long-term health and viability of brands at large. And so that was also a big part of the decision-making factor when we started talking about a global RFI. That was the first of the two phases. And where I think sometimes many of us who have been in the industry, both on the agency side and within brands, have gotten in the last couple of years to the point where I think we believe that there's unanimity of support for the concept, right? You're not going to find any person in my chair anywhere in the world or anyone in an agency chair who would say it's not critically important. At some point, that reality has to force you to ask yourself, well, then what's the barrier to there being meaningful traction and results? And I think increasingly there are a few of us who are coming to the realization that until brands put their foots down and decide that they are going to require solid progress action, and that there's an accountability mechanism beyond a talking point, that you're not going to see meaningful, measurable, real change happen in terms of the real stats around diversity and inclusion being successful. And so I certainly came to this role with that point of view, and then the RFI, RFP exercise with that as a clear expectation that we were going to do it. Spent some time building the internal support for the commitment, and then decided again through the two phases, an RFI that went to several agencies, with the requirement being, in addition to responding to some of the creative questions that we asked, they were also asked to disclose their diversity statistics for management, not just administrative personnel, and that data would be an indicator, one of the indicators that we used to determine the agencies that were invited to participate in the RFP, and then for the RFP that would also be a part of the evaluation criterion as well. And more importantly, that it would be an ongoing measurement reporting expectation for whatever agency we decided to work with as well.
And so it's not just a one-off.
Right. Those kinds of teeth are critical, I think, if they're going to be solid action, I believe, taken on this issue in a way that we're not talking about it in 5 more years. Or if we're talking about it, we're talking about it through the context of having done some very positive, successful things, albeit still needing to continue to focus in that area.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that it's only really through initiatives like this that you can engender this kind of change, because otherwise it is a lot of talking.
Yes.
But when a big client actually says, I want to see progress on this, and this is going to form a part of the selection criteria, and so it's actually impacting an agency's business,
right,
you would expect that change to happen.
Right.
What did you think when you actually saw the stats in terms of diversity that were communicated? You don't have to put any agencies on the spot, but was it better or worse than you expected?
I think in some instances better. In some instances, I was probably a little surprised by. I'd categorize, our industry, again, of which I'm a part, in two areas. And so I think there's still those of us who probably look at this issue as still a little bit more of a marketing exercise, positioning, and perhaps or not as focused on real, meaningful, substantive initiatives designed to address the challenge. And I think the second half of that are probably those of us, in the agency side as well, who have done yeoman's work to deal with the foundational challenges that exist beyond the marketing of it as a priority. And so I'd say I was impressed by a lot, but also surprised in many areas we still are very traditional in the way we view this issue and approaches to solving the problem.
Yeah.
I do think one of the other points you made a little earlier in terms of where I generally see more progress on the brand side than the agent side, and again, this is a generalization.
Sure.
There are obviously exceptions. But I think one of the things, and I speak about this often, that I was impressed by on the brand side is, and this is certainly true even today, my annual compensation is impacted by the degree to which I am successful at hiring, recruiting, and retaining diverse talent.
Right.
And when you have those kinds of mechanisms, there are few other things that help focus both a leader's time and also a business's priorities if it's not being impacted at the pocketbook level.
Right. Nothing incentivizes like an incentive.
Right. So beyond my view that it's a business imperative, it's not a nice to do. It helps also that my colleagues and I see real meaningful change in a very significant area that helps us focus on not just the words but the real results behind what we talk about as our commitment to really diversifying the discipline in a really meaningful way.
And so presumably you have some insight into how to diversify the discipline, as you've put it, because one of the things I think agencies still struggle with is actually putting it into practice and coming up with methods and means and plans and programs that do deliver results, both in terms of recruitment and retention, and creating that kind of inclusive culture where different people, different points of view are not just tolerated but accepted and encouraged. And I don't want to get too deep into this because we could talk about this for hours, but if there's any kind of top line thoughts you had or advice for agencies that are struggling with this.
Yeah. And so I think two things, and this is where I think sometimes it can be a little frustrating as we think about, again, the challenges we have at really trying to, I know we're never going to solve it, but the challenges that seem to be consistent around addressing it in a way that is consistent across the board. There's so much research that's been done on this issue, right, in terms of the data that looks at the reasons why we have challenges on the recruitment, on the retention, against levels, against different constituencies. I mean, the data is there. I mean, I think at the end of the day, if there was some new report that was possible to be done that shared some new insight, I'd be shocked. If we don't know already the core indices behind this challenge. And so I am at the point where I truly believe that dealing with it boils down to leadership and commitment.
Right, the will.
Because beyond all these things, programs and training and initiatives and compensation and those kind of things, it will still boil down to a leader deciding, I, on the strength of what I can control and do, will do A, B, C, and D. And I think both at the agency, leadership level and for brands, there is a point where perhaps the last mile is that individual, I will show you how this should be done. And I think at the end of the day, that's where I believe most of us have the opportunity to influence today and now, whether that starts with one role or one team or one initiative. I think we need that kind of leadership and commitment to really start to show some results.
And what do you say to agency people? I've spoken to some who think that, these kinds of initiatives where clients are asking agencies for their diversity stats are, just putting agencies on the spot and not allowing them to actually do the work that's required to change and get better.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, that was the reason that we committed very early on in our RFI process that we weren't going to disclose any of this data, right? We didn't want this to be seen as a threat.
Right.
And I think to your point that someone mentioned, I do think part of the incentive around doing that was to make it clear this is an iterative process, right? And so I don't think we were certainly not expecting to see agencies who had solved it, because it's not. I certainly have the appreciation that this is an ongoing challenge, and incremental change is not bad. And I do think at the end of the day we need to give ourselves a little bit of room here to continue to address and navigate and pivot based on individual situations and agencies and client dynamics and all those variables that I do think have an impact on the degree to which we can be successful in this area. But I think the pressure needs to be there because, again, absence of forcing factor, I think we all know what human behavior is more likely to produce, which is more inertia.
Yeah.
And that can't be the solution either.
Sure. And you worked agency side for several years. I mean, whilst you were agency side, did you ever think to yourself, okay, these cultures are just not inclusive enough and there's a lot of work to be done here, or was your experience different?
No, I think it's clearly, and this is, obviously for me, 7-8 years ago that I was last in the agency world. But I mean, I think it's been fairly consistent, the cultural realities of agencies.
Yep.
And again, these are generalizations. I think you have many agencies are quite well-meaning and well-intentioned in this space. There's just not a lot of, they're there yet today, again, pockets. And so I think at the end of the day, it's back to that question of leadership and courage, commitment to figure out how to do something that is meaningful. That is where we have the biggest opportunity today.
Sure. So just one more question about agencies, and then we'll come back to your role at Lenovo. Obviously, you had this review, so I assume it gave you quite a lot of insight into the way agencies are progressing these days. There's a lot of angst on the agency side about the model, and whether it's fit for purpose, and whether holding groups will go out of fashion. From your perspective, do you think that's fair, or do you think the agency model needs to change? Do you think they're doing okay? I mean, is it an obvious answer? Yeah,
I think it is. I mean, I think we certainly on the brand side and through this RFP process, to varying degrees, many of the agencies are grappling with these questions. I think at the end of the day, the reality is a lot of us on the brand side are grappling with the need to reinvent, transform ourselves, just given what's happening in the integrated marketing communications sphere.
Sure.
And so I think agencies feel a pressure, and legitimately so, that the business has fundamentally changed. Clients are fundamentally under pressure to deliver a different kind of result in a different environment. And I think that mandates that our partners on the agency side, and this is not just comms, it's the entire integrated marketing space, have to undergo that same kind of transformation. I think on the agency side is probably a little more existential than it is on the brand side, but I think we're all dealing with this continuum of change, and the degree to which we are successful as agencies or brands, I think really will have a long-term impact on the influence we have across the discipline. And so I think the agency pressure is well suited, just like it is for me and my peers, to focus on what needs to be a fairly radical transformation of our craft as well on the brand side.
Sure. And how are you responding to that pressure at Lenovo? I know at Verizon, for example, I recall reading that you had implemented a kind of agile framework for your teams. Is that the kind of thing that you think is going to help the communications function adapt to all of this disruption?
I think so. I mean, I think there are several things that we have to do. And so again, you mentioned the way we think about, staffing our teams, out of what was traditionally a very hierarchical model, organized around products or business units. Again, that much more mapped to, I'd say, an era that we've long since left. Versus where we begin to align ourselves around looking at what the real competencies of this integrated communications discipline of the future looks like. That addresses, I think, what have been some tectonic shifts. You think about the explosion of influencers, the demand for content, the daily crises that we deal with as brands, the consolidation of media that continues to happen at a pretty unprecedented pace, and then the rapid expansion of social and tech and all these things. It's really forcing us to think differently about what we do, how we do it, and who we do it with in terms of, again, the skills and competencies. And so it's fairly overwhelming on some days to think about the kinds of things that we've got to think differently about as a discipline, but it's critical. And I think, again, back to this conversation around existential crises, I think we're at an inflection point as a discipline as well, where we've got to make some very, very tough choices. We fundamentally are being challenged by our organizations, by our C-suite leadership, to deliver against a new set of priorities, a new way of thinking. And the success at which we can do that is directly tied to some of these fundamental, model questions that we're talking about, that are certainly top of mind for me in terms of the things that I have prioritized trying to address pretty quickly.
So a big change in, for example, the skills that you're incorporating into your teams?
Yes.
And so presumably, are you looking in different places for those skills as well?
Right. Yeah, I think in the priority of building an integrated function, right, that maps this landscape that I'm talking about, that I describe as much more, again, integrated communications or integrated marketing, that is out of this siloed discipline where, historically it was media relations, and actually maybe not more than that, videos and those kinds of things, to a much more integrated discipline. If you think about managing content and understanding channel management and understanding influencers and audiences, and being able to integrate data and glean meaningful insights from that data to inform the way we think about a strategy. When we think about the challenges of a creative team, and those kinds of skill sets that we need to factor into, again, what is not the traditional comms function. I mean, those mean that we're talking about fundamentally recruiting a different type of person than might have been historically associated with a corporate communications organization or a PR organization or a media relations organization. And that is where I think the competencies of this next 5-year, 7-year period have also got to evolve pretty dramatically to ensure we have access to that talent.
A lot of overlap with marketing, as you mentioned. You talked about it in terms of integrated marketing. Does that just mean the functions come together?
I do think it's happening. It's happened in many places. And it's driven by, again, I alluded to it a little bit, this changing environment in which we operate, where historically, I think if you think about it, marketing was generally the domain of customer, thinking priorities, or they own that, and we, the comm side of that, was generally influencers, government, and so today, the mandate, if I think about the kinds of conversations we have at the CEO level, is it's the one voice mandate, right? So that is our priority, going to market with one voice across audiences, across geographies, across channels, you name it, and that forces this melding of what was, again, historically this view of marketing owns the customer, and you all own everything else, or stakeholders, with generally that purview. And so as opposed to coming at it from the audience centric view, it's message first, or story first, and then how we organize around delivering that consistent story means that there's a natural melding that has to happen of what were traditionally pretty siloed disciplines.
And some of you mentioned the daily crisis, and some of the responses we've seen to crises, whether it's from United, or this isn't a crisis response, but the PepsiCo ad. they seem to indicate that, perhaps the public relations or communications function doesn't have the influence that it should be having in the right places, whether that's the top of the organization or whether that's on the marketing side of the equation. I mean, how big a risk do you think that is, and how do you think that can be addressed?
It is fascinating. I think there are a couple crises over the last few months. If you look at them, at least from the outside, they seem to communicate some lack of cohesion in an approach. And so I do wonder. Obviously, I don't know the inner workings of some of these organizations, and so I'm speaking again in generalizations. But I do think there is a challenge within any organization that is people and personalities, right? So the best advice we know in any scenario is largely going to be secondary to a leader's point of view on how to, address that particular challenge. The hope, the ideal would be that the voices that we represent in our discipline and the credibility of our approach has the significance of weight and influence to drive an outcome. In many instances, we know that's not the case. Again, comms or brand or reputation, or whatever it might be, titled as, may not have the stature and the imprimatur to force an outcome or influence the CEO's decision making about how he thinks the situation ought to be addressed. And so those are unfortunate. I do think at the end of the day that some of what we see and what looks like poor decision making at a brand level is perhaps a reflection of internal dysfunctions, and perhaps this is a concern that perhaps it's a reflection of where we have not earned the level of credibility because of the way we practice our craft, perhaps. And so, but I do wonder in terms of what really goes on there. There are some that are head scratchers when you see the way they have been managed.
I think internal dysfunction is definitely something to blame. You mentioned the personality as a factor here. So what kind of personality do you think is required to make sure that, or at least to improve the chances of being heard at the top, to improve that kind of credibility of the message? Right.
I mean, at the end of the day, we're still in a relationship business, right? And so I think in some ways I often describe that I feel like my role for the last several years has moved more beyond the functional expertise required and more to that of a behavioral psychologist, right? In terms of
just persuading people.
Managing the disparate personalities in a C-suite, building trust. And again, less functional trust, that's generally a given at some point in your career, and more interpersonal trust in the disposition, the countenance, the credibility of the perspective that you represent, and the insight that lives hopefully in the seat of a CCO or the most senior person advising a C-suite leader in a crisis. And so it's interesting, but I do think for most of us at a certain level, that is where the rubber meets the road. Again, less the functional and more the influence I've been able to glean because of what I bring to the table and that relationship that I've created. And that's traditionally back to the skills and competencies, right? That's been one that has been harder to teach.
Right. I was going to ask, have you been trained for this?
Right. It is maturity, right? I think it is seasoning, it's perspective, it's many things that are hard to write. And I think therein lies a challenge, right, for some of us and some of my peers when you're dealing with some massive, brand reputational challenges of a pretty major scale.
Do you see the next generation of talent holding more promise in this regard?
I think there's more promise given the diversity of experience I think they begin with. if I look at the pools of candidates that we are recruiting across, entry to mid-level today, and again, this integrated competency that we're talking about, not the traditional, I feel like they will be better prepared with a clear understanding of what this new environment looks like, the new influence environment looks like, and perhaps how to glean influence within that environment. And so I think that's a better jumping off place, right? If you think about my peers and I, generally, that was what we learned on the fly, or learned later in career as these technologies and generational shifts emerged. And so I certainly believe, beginning with that as a core to the way you've operated and behaved, Generation Z is entering the marketplace this year, and so this will be the first generation that's only known, mobile, the internet. And so I think that will certainly be a benefit. I do think at the end of the day, the things we're talking about, it's just hard work. And that growth development is the result of only putting in the time and effort and energy to understanding, to getting to know, to having a perspective that is global and broad and different, and perhaps having a different perspective on kind of the world that is also a big part of being able to influence in these discussions as well. The aperture through which you view not just the crisis of the day, but through which you view the ultimate marketplace that you're trying to influence around.
Yeah, that, I guess, cultural intelligence.
Yes.
So let's, for my last question, let's go back a little bit in terms of your career. After the September 11th attacks, you were in fact in charge of setting up a crisis communications function, if I'm not mistaken, which dealt with the Anthrax threat. Is that correct?
Right. Anthrax ricin.
What was that like, and what did you learn from that experience?
Right. It was fascinating. So this was in the context of a political environment. So this was, with the U.S. Congress, and so it was one of the appealing aspects of the role starting out was being able to work in politics in an apolitical role,
right?
To drive something that was, again, crisis strategy, crisis planning, crisis communication. At that time seemed to be something that, of course, just this unanimity of support for that.
Right, everyone wanted it.
Yes.
Right.
But you learn very quickly, as in all politics, everything is political, right? There's no such thing as an apolitical team, organization, entity. And so anyway, that was a piece of insight that was valuable for me, a life lesson. But I do think more transactionally to that time where we were dealing with things that we'd never seen before as a country, as a nation. The big positive among many was that there was an interest in, one, bringing in outside expertise to create from the ground up an approach that didn't exist in the public sector. And that was where brands are much more disciplined about crisis planning, response, management, again, in the context of some of the things we're discussing, not always, but generally better at those kinds of things. And so it was a fascinating chance to build a mechanism to train and enable our political leaders in the country to be able to organize around a consistent message and a process, right, for communicating in an unbelievably challenged environment where media were really demanding information, perhaps faster than there was the ability to deliver it or to understand what truth was and what was really needing to be communicated. So it was interesting. We were talking about it a little earlier. It seems like it was forever ago, but it was not that long ago. But I think in many ways it's back to the conversation we were having about the benefit of having a much more diverse set of skills and competencies that you bring to the table. That was a huge set of stakeholders across an unbelievably complex, again, public and government organization that had to be aligned, that had never been before at all.
Right.
And so crisis is always a good mechanism as well for bringing people together. In a functional sense, it was a great mechanism for bringing together the communications minds around how to construct something that heretofore had not existed. So that was an unbelievably exciting assignment.
Do you miss being a political communicator in today's environment?
I don't. Some days I feel like I still am, but I don't miss that at all. I'm much more excited to be an observer on the sidelines. as opposed to in that day-to-day battle.
Okay, excellent. Well, Torod, thank you so much for
Thank
your
you.
time. This has been great. I really appreciate it. I know that you are probably extremely jet lagged, and yet you've answered the questions extremely eloquently. So thank you for that, and with a lot of insight.
Well, I appreciate your time. It's great to talk to you as always.
Excellent.
You've been listening to The Echo Chamber. Brought to you by The Holmes Report and produced by Marketeers. Sponsored by March Communications, connecting innovation and people.